Hey ho. We have a nice crowd here today. I'm really happy and warmed and all of those things to see so many people here. This is the first, I hope, many Take Two speaker series talks. I'm Dr. Claudia Malacrida. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research, and I want to thank my team, Rachel Clark, Penny Dagnon. Throw your hands in the air like you just don't care because I can't see you. There you are. Penny Pickles, Jillian Laird, who can't be here, and Hector McIntyre, who can't be here, who contribute to the concept of this series and also the organization of it, because I cannot organize. The concept, I think, is a really important one. We have some assumptions about the way research is done, that psychologists should look at development, and neuroscientists should look at how it is that brains function and develop in the world, and that environmental scientists should look at sustainability, and those assumptions are sometimes faulty. So it's with some considerable excitement that I introduce our first talk, which is on understanding childhood and difference defined in some really oppositional ways too, around culture, around perceptions of ability, and around whether or not institutions are innocent or culpable in making those categorizations. The idea for this series came out of a desire to showcase the research and the creativity amongst our colleagues in a way that highlights a number of things. So first of all, we wanted to show that any particular research concern, whether it's a social problem or a challenge to living a rich, healthy, and rewarding life, or a need for an innovation to accommodate inclusion, these concerns are critical to individuals, to their communities, and to our societies, and they can and probably should be addressed in multiple ways with multiple expected outcomes. We wanted to highlight that science, education, the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, management, and health research not only have different things to say about and contribute to resolving thorny problems, but that by approaching these questions from multiple directions, we obtain richer insights than if we just used a single entry point. We also hope that by bringing disparate disciplines and approaches together, we might be able to get people to talk to one another across disciplinary silos, which is critical. Dr. Newberry, who is going to be one of our speakers today, is part of an interdisciplinary center, the Institute for Child and Youth Studies, that has people from neuroscience to education and all points in between. And I think it's been a really rich collaborative field that's been improved by those conversations across silos. We also wanted to recognize both senior and new faculty. So you're not senior. I'm just wanting to say that right here and now, you are not senior. But I think we want to recognize that people are at different places in their research careers, that we have the benefit of august and sustained research insight in some of our senior colleagues who've been approaching issues over a long period of time and have depth that is really outstanding. And then we have new researchers who are bringing new energy and new theories to these problems. And this can create some interesting synergies as well. And finally, we wanted through this series to include people who we recognize as excellent. That's a word that has got a lot of transport in the universe these days. People use it a lot. But basically, we are taking excellence from the perspective of our office, which deals with research funding, but also nominating for people for awards or overlooking these centers and institutes where there's this exciting work taking place. So we have a kind of an insider knowledge and a special framing of what we count to be excellence here. So without too much more ado, I'll just do a little housekeeping. There'll be a 15 to 20 minute talk, and then I'll introduce the next speaker, and then we'll hold our questions, if you don't mind, till the end. One thing I know about democracy, though, is that there isn't really any, and that and it's very often happens that the last person gets most questions because people's memories are like good for 3 minutes. So if you have the ability to write something down, and then you're going to be in a position that you'll be able to interrogate both of these researchers, so I'd suggest that. So our first speaker is Dr. Jeffrey MacCormack. He's an assistant professor of educational psychology and inclusion at the University of Lethbridge in the Faculty of Education. As a former classroom teacher, Dr. MacCormack's research on after-school programs, executive functions, social competence, and play-based learning is also informed by 10 years of experience teaching elementary students, he's still standing, and many years of teaching post-secondary adult learners. His work focuses on creating spaces where youth can thrive. He loves novelty socks and has an orange Persian kitten named Oliver, who is a troublemaker. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Claudia. I really appreciate this. So my talk today is on social play of youth with autism spectrum disorder and some of the work that we've been doing in schools and in after-school programs as well. And as Claudia mentioned, I'm also part of the Institute for Child and Youth Studies, which is a really useful and effective way to share ideas and talk about topics through different lenses. So yeah. First, just a few things just to start us off here. Thank you guys so much for coming here, by the way. This has been great. I'm really happy to be sort of the first speaker in this series, and I'm really happy to have such a giant room here. Maybe it's the booze, I'm not totally sure, but either way, I'm glad to have you here. So, also you should know that I have all my life been a stutterer, and so over the course of my talk, you may see moments of disfluency. I don't feel weird about it. You shouldn't feel weird about it. It's just part of being me, and I'm okay with it. So. I'll be talking a lot about Minecraft today, so the first question I'll ask you guys is, where are my Minecrafters at? Show of hands. Oh my goodness. Plug into your culture, nerds. Okay, well, then this will be sort of a conversation about how that whole thing works. All right, so this disembodied head is a Russian thinker named Vygotsky, and he said some really fabulous things about play. And I mention it now because I think it's important to include a rationale for the value of play, not just for pleasure seeking or for being a kid, but through all of our stages of life, there's a lot of value for development. So this is what he said. He said, play creates a zone of proximal development of the child. In play, a child always behaves beyond his average age, above his daily behavior. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. I love that line. And he goes on to say, as in the focus of a magnifying glass, play contains all developmental tendencies in a condensed form and is itself a major form of development. This is something that popped up on my feed earlier on today, so I want to show you guys just to remind you of the value of play. So, as we move through life, play changes. Obviously, it starts off, it's quite based on exploration and pretend play. But as we get older, we end up sort of adding rules to it. And sometimes these kinds of rules influence how we're socializing as well. Isn't that guy great? I love that guy. Speaking of socializing, a big part of my work has been on social competence. So let's talk about that for a moment. So for researchers who have been looking at social competence, there are many ways to both understand, teach, and measure social competence. For instance, we have something up here. Being able to stand in line, understand turn taking, that's a big one. Also making eye contact is important. The image of the kids hugging is all about how deeply integrated into your social circle you are. And the last one is being able to speak. And of course, there are many, many more than this. But I mention these because these variables fall on a spectrum for researchers, which is incredibly frustrating. In that, on one side is eye contact, which really isn't what social competence is. If you just maximize eye contact and walk around the university making deep eye contact with everyone around you, no one's going to say, wow, that guy's really smooth. They'll say, that guy is a creep. So that variable is not a great one, but of course we can measure it extremely easily. On the other side of the spectrum, we have something which really gets to the heart of what social competence is, which is how protected against the forces of exclusion or loneliness are you through your social network? And that's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about competence, but that's very hard to measure. I'd have to go around and speak to everyone in your social group and say, what do you really think of Claudia? And of course, that would be unethical to do that and also implausible as well. So a part of what we're trying to do here is to find ways to both teach, measure, and experience socializing, because it is more like swimming than it is about learning skills, in that you can read a book about swimming, but you actually have to get wet at some point. And also I think the metaphor extends as well, because if you have a negative swimming experience, you may sort of develop some anxiety and then stay away from the pool more than you normally would, thereby reducing your ability to swim later in life. So I think there's lots of great comparisons there. So social competence is one of these things, and these are things that we know in the field, but to move forward with this conversation, you have to know that it is a subjective construct, which means this: you may think you know how socially competent you are, you don't. We do, but you don't. As I was mentioning earlier on, it's really difficult to measure. It's poorly defined, and that's partly because it's difficult to measure sort of what it really truly is. And ultimately, it's based on a deficit model, which means that we don't really care about it until it's gone wrong somehow. So that's an issue as well. But despite all of these challenges and all of these sort of drawbacks, it's predictive of emotional well-being and lifelong success, both in academic and in workplaces. And those kids who are falling out of their social groups in grade 3, and then in grade 6, and then by grade 9, are increasing their risk of having a harder time networking for work or doing some group work over their B.Ed program. All of these things require a lot of socializing, and we end up identifying those people who are not abiding by our social rules, even if they're unwritten, and we exclude them pretty quickly and pretty naturally. Speaking of social exclusion, I want to talk about autism spectrum disorder, because that's been the area of my research as well. I won't go into it. I know that we have a lot of people in this room who know a lot about ASD already, but I will go so far as to say this. Understanding the etymology of the word autism is a way of sort of understanding what it actually means. So Leo Kanner was one of the first researchers who started to identify kids who were, they didn't have any cognitive deficit, and so there was no easy explanation for why they were so self-interested and focused on themselves and uninterested in others. And so what he ended up calling it is autoism, which became autism. And that's kind of a good way to think about it when we're talking about play here. So during play, what we have is this situation where the kids are thinking, I'm more important than you, my interests are more important than your interests, and ultimately you're an obstacle between me and what I want to do. So during play experiences, this can end up sort of being really challenging. So here's a screenshot from Minecraft World, and I hope you are taking a look at that. What's happening there at the bottom is pretty beautiful. They made some sort of like rainbow gateway to this, to a structure they were building. But this is actually a really good example of what I like to call structured play. So structured play is really important because play experiences on themselves can be creative and autonomous and volitional and voluntary, which is wonderful, but you can also structure play so that it mimics the give and take of social interactions. This area has been moved forward by a researcher named Daniel Legoff, who sort of worked on this area called Lego therapy. And basically his work was to take kids with ASD and put them in groups of 3 in these little triads and give them roles. So there'd be a kid who's an engineer and a supplier and a builder, and the adult was there sort of to help them sort of through a little bit. And the engineer had the visual guide of the Lego group, and the supplier had all of the sort of box of Legos, and the builder was one who actually got to build the T-Rex or the truck or whatever it is they were building. And early on in my doctoral work, I went and did an ethnographic study of these kind of interactions, and something I was looking at was the rates of social bids. So the first thing that happens is that the engineer offers a social bid to the supplier because he says, hey, we need a red 4x2 block. And then the supplier then passes it over to the builder. Then the engineer tells the builder where to put it. But inside this system, and here's sort of where here's where the important part is, there's tension built into this because only one person has the blocks. So kids have to practice their socializing, otherwise the whole train goes off the rails. Nothing gets built. So the idea that tension is built into the play is really important. So that's one of those things that we use to sort of gum up the experience of play, because it's important for kids to be able to reach a problem together, and this kind of model creates its own problems. There'll be kids who are saying, no, it's my turn, or I want to be supplier first, and that sort of thing. And then being able to work through it together is really important. So what can they use to work through it? Well, they have shared objectives. That's the visual guide. And they also have roles. So each person has their own role to work through. And according to Legoff's model of evaluation, There is a pre and a post, of course, but each of the sessions here, and there'll be more than 6, but just for 6 for an example, the kids start off with their structure play, and then they move to their free play. So even though it looks like they're doing all of the structure play and then all their free play, the model actually goes like this, where they start off with their pre and then go to that first structure play and then to their free play and then all the way along. So every night has an opportunity for them to practice this structured play where they are like forced by the game to sort of work through some of these challenges, and then afterwards they get to have free play, which is totally their own choice. And kids do what kids want to do in those instances, and early on what they do is they just walk away and they say, phew, I'm glad I ate all my veggies, now I'm going to go have my treat, and my treat is to play alone. But as Legoff's work has shown, as they start to build some of these skills and competencies, they end up choosing to play with each other again. And so my work has been to sort of explore that interaction. What happens with these kids? It's really hard to pin down for those reasons that I talked about. So I did some work with Lego, and then I moved over to Minecraft, not just because I love it and my daughters love it, but because as I spoke to kids, that's what they said was the thing that was really interesting to them. Go and ask kids between the ages of like 8 and 13 what Minecraft is, and I would be shocked if they don't know what it is. It's really important for them. So the idea of having an interest-based gameplay is really important. So I didn't have visual guides, so I would sort of create these sort of shared objectives for the kids. So I tried to choose things that would be interesting to 9-year-olds. So you can see up there on the top left, I said build a giant toilet. So Minecraft is almost like a online virtual Lego space where you can go and walk around and build things just like you would in Lego, but you're actually building with these blocks. And so, as you can see, they were sort of building structures. But ultimately, here's the question: where's the tension? Unfortunately, no one in this room knows what Minecraft is, so I'll let you know that one of the challenges here is that, okay, think back to the Lego, for instance. The tension was around only one person had the toy, but with Minecraft, everyone has infinite access to the resources. So in theory, these kids could just take their toys and just go play on a different virtual hill and never actually come together. So I created 3 roles, the architect, the artist, and the foreman, knowing they all have infinite resources. The architect and the artist are given the objective. The architect plans it out on a whiteboard first, and then the artist then chooses the colors and some of the decorations. And then here's where the tension is built in. They pass the plans over to the foreman, and then they move into that virtual space. Now, even though the architect and the artist had built everything and dreamed it all up and created it, it's now 100% in the foreman's lap. And maybe that foreman has a different vision for your arch or your giant toilet, and that's going to cause problems. But that's actually ends up being sort of a good thing because solving those problems is part of what we're doing here. So they move into the space like I mentioned. And also there's an adult there sort of in that triad space to help them out. Now, for those of you who know a thing or two about Minecraft, you may also know that there's sort of a tension around the idea of using technology to teach socializing, because this is the question that I get asked a lot. Is this what socializing looks like? And I think that we would generally agree that this is not what socializing looks like. In fact, often there'll be comics about people who are like zombies now because they have their phone out and they're sort of nosing their way through traffic and stuff. But something that's really neat about this kind of intervention is eye contact is difficult for kids with ASD, or it tends to be difficult for kids with ASD in general. And for actually many years, what we did was we taught/forced kids to make eye contact in a way that felt unnatural for them. But this is a way for them to socialize and collaborate and work together in a way that doesn't require them to make eye contact. Because even though they're not making eye contact here in this room, they were making eye contact in that virtual space. So this actually is this moment and this kid in his virtual space. And although, unfortunately, you can't see exactly where he's looking, but these 2 boys right here in the white and the black, they're making eye contact because they are looking to share information about what to do next in this space. So for my data collection, I ended up having the actual in-life interactions videotaped, as well as the in-game interactions, because there's a lot of stuff to, no pun intended, mine out from there as well. So earlier on I was talking about the social tension as part of this play, and I want to kind of walk you through one of these examples so you can sort of imagine what these kind of interactions were like. We did go and and collect data on certain variables which are used in the field. But a big part of this for me was actually getting down to these moments, these little problems, and see how they were solved, and see if there's a difference between how they were solved in the early sessions and in the later sessions as well. So let me just show you one of what ended up being hundreds of these little moments. So I call this one, "May I please have a house?" And actually, I'm going to show you some sort of in-game interactions for two reasons. One, so that you can sort of see them sort of doing this thing while I'm talking about what's happening, but also because I think it's important that you sort of see the visual while you're working on. So, all right, 1 second. So like I mentioned earlier on, I ended up sort of putting both of the video streams on the same image here. So I'm going to show you sort of how this works, but I will mostly show you this side over here because I want it to be nice and clear on the screen. So.
Okay, cool. So the T, Thomas, why don't we put the T?
Sorry. So their task here was to build a raft in the clouds, and so they sort of worked things out. One boy wanted diamonds, which is that blue square right there, and the other boy wanted to use glowstone. And so as they were working through, one boy said, "Hey, I really want to build a house on the top of this raft." And the other boy said, "Absolutely not, we're going to build initials." And over the span of 1 minute, this boy requested a house to be built 5 times, which is characteristic of this sort of high interest and perseverative focus. And then as they were building it, he had a hard time sort of building his initial on the top of the raft. And then finally, this boy's glowstone was sort of in his little space here. And he ended up saying, "Look, I'm going to build a house anyway." And then he said something that I just love so much because it really sort of, it really characterized sort of early gameplay interactions. He said, "Dude, your glowstone is in my way." Which I love because that really represents that whole, like, you are an obstacle between what I want right now and me, so move out of my space here. As they were going through, though, the focus of their interest ended up becoming not just an obstacle for their interactions, but a way to hook each other into their play. So just to kind of zoom through the variables here a little bit, we used 3 variables, and these are common in the field. So level of engagement, affect, and initiations. And I am going to move over here to initiations because this is the one that really speaks to it. So initiations are a measure of the number of spontaneous, peer-directed utterances that are not preceded by another youth's question or comment requiring a response. And as I was mentioning earlier on, there are 2 kinds of areas here. First off, we have our structure play, which is that dark orange line on the top, and then we have the free play. Now, all of the rates of the structured play interactions are relatively high because, I mean, gosh, it makes sense. They were required by the play to be interacting and seeking each other out. And so, so this is no, so this is no surprise for us. But it's the free play interactions as they started to, like, of their own volition, seek each other out that ended up sort of being sort of an interesting trend. So what does this actually mean, in layman's terms here? Number one, by the later sessions, the youth spoke directly with each other rather than asking open-ended questions or asking adults. Youth used more direct bids and spoke to other youth more often in the later sessions than the early ones. The youth participants solved their own problems. So this is something that you can only see when you have every moment of every interaction on record and coded. But of the 279 times that the adults spoke in session 1, for instance, they were trying to resolve some kind of role-based tension about 15 or 16% of the time. In session 6, the influence of the adults had been reduced quite a bit. The adults had to resolve tension much less frequently, about 3 or 4%. So the kids themselves moved over and took power of the role of sort of navigating those tense moments. Their socializing became more effective. Relative to the rates of initiations in the early sessions, the youth initiated more during the later sessions as well. So there was a big boost, and we saw that on our graph earlier on. And as I mentioned earlier on, the youth's interest became a way for them to connect rather than to be distant. And as I mentioned earlier on, there was a boy who was saying like, dude, your glowstone's in my way. Well, it was that boy who said during the later sessions, you know, hey, do you want to join me? I'm going to put pigs in a minecart and make them go down the mountain. Now, that statement seems kind of random, out of context, but that was the preferred interest of the other boy he was speaking to. So they used interests as a way of sort of pulling them in together. And I would love to chat with you guys more about this. I hope you guys have some questions about sort of the method or the mode of this. It's been really, a lot of fun. And I'm always looking for people who are interested in exploring play and different kinds of, learning through play experiences. So anyway, thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. That was a great talk, and I've got lots of questions. We'll talk later. I'll introduce here now Dr. Janice Newberry, Jan. She's a cultural anthropologist, so a little bit of a different take. She's worked in Java, Indonesia since 1992. Her 2006 book, Backdoor Java, State Formation in the Domestic Working Class, doesn't really sort of give an indication of this interest in childhood, but it considered the role of neighborhood women in managing their communities. Her more recent work has transmuted into studying early childhood education, care, and development programs that emerged in Indonesia in response to World Bank and other intergovernmental initiatives. She's been a fellow at the Asia Research Institute in the National University of Singapore and at Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. She's a co-founder of the Institute for Child and Youth Studies at the University of Lethbridge, and she's currently involved in a collaborative transmedia project on ethnographic methods with local Blackfeet people. Welcome, and thank you for your presentation.
Well, while Rachel's getting me hooked up, I just want to say thanks, Jeffrey, who's just left. Where's in the back? Getting boozed up. Okay, good. I do that too. Thanks, Jeffrey, for sharing the stage with me. Thanks to Claudia for arranging this series. I think it's pretty exciting. Thanks to the Office of Research and Innovation Services for setting it up. And thanks for coming out as well. You think my clicker works? Wouldn't that be great if it did?
Growing pains.
It's okay. No worries. We'll get there. Yeah. Hey. Oh. Well, that seems an improvement. Here. There we go. Got it. Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for the support. I have given a talk about the Raising Spirit Project several times in the last few weeks, and some of you have probably heard it. So my job, what I've decided to do today is to go through that very quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions about it during the question period, because I have a few things I want to say in addition to talking about the project. So I'm going to go through this part a little bit quickly. So this is the result of a 7-year project between the Institute for Child and Youth Studies and Opokaa-sin Early Intervention Society. Here are our funders, and sadly, Office of Research Services doesn't appear there under the U of L logo, as it should, Claudia. But these are folks who contributed to this project. The genesis of this project was me meeting Tanya Pace-Crosschild, who is the executive director of Opokaa-sin Early Intervention Society, a local nonprofit devoted to the children and families of indigenous people. And when I met Tanya, she and I both had a shared question. What do we do about understanding child-rearing values among people who don't write their child-rearing values down? So for me, in Indonesia, we were seeing the advent of global early childhood programs about the ages 0 to 8, how to improve them. And most of these World Bank-funded programs, UNESCO-funded programs, brought in values that were from the outside, and there wasn't much questioning about what Javanese people cared about. For Tanya, the same thing was happening here in southern Alberta. There was an interest in improving Head Start programming, but not very much interest in what Blackfoot folk care about in their own child rearing. And of course, in the Canadian context, this is particularly an issue because child rearing, how do we learn it? We learn it from watching it, from our parents. And so because of colonialism and years of genocidal violence, residential schooling, the 60s scoop, and continuing patterns of foster care, many Indigenous children don't get to see that. So the question was, how do we get at these values that no one's writing down and maybe inchoate, implicit, not spoken about? So we landed on using photo elicitation as a way to get people to talk about the values in their lives. And so what happened is early on we gave 8 cameras out to people who either worked for Opokaa-sin or were using the services of Opokaa-sin and asked them to take pictures of child rearing. And they produced 8,000 photos. So you be happy to know I'm not going to show you 8,000 photographs now, but I'm going to show you a few. And what's interesting about these photographs is, as I always say, they're pretty boring. And that's the point. So Tanya wanted to demonstrate to people the resilience of Blackfoot families here in southern Alberta. They're doing what everybody's doing. They're raising their families, happy families, functioning families. And these photos capture that brilliantly. So the first part of this project was all about collecting these photos and then taking them and using them to interview people. So there were several different ways this happened. First of all, we hired DJ Bruised Head and Allison Crop-Eared Wolf. These are undergraduate students here at the University of Lethbridge. And they went back and took those photos to the photographers and said, what was important in this picture? Why did you take this picture? They then took a selection of those photos and went to powwows in historic Blackfoot territory. And they would set up a little table and they said, take a look at the pictures. What do you see here? And as I always say, so these are some of the most powerful interviews because often you hear people saying, I didn't have that. I wish I had that. That's something that was taken away from me. And finally, those photographs were brought back to elders who work for Opokaa-sin. And they were asked about what values they thought. So you can see we had an amazing amount of data collected at this point. Now the project at that point sort of went into a hiatus, but it picked up again in 2015 when we started 2 exciting summers of field work. So this was partially prompted by new people who joined the team. Erin Spring was our postdoc, the first postdoc at the Institute for Child and Youth Studies. Amy Mack, who was a graduate student here at the U of L, now off to the U of A to get her PhD, and Taylor Little Mustache, who's just entered the Faculty of Education here at the University of Lethbridge. What we decided to do was to continue to collect stories on the land from elders, to go out into the field and hear these stories in the places that they are located, and also to hear from local people about this. So one of the things that happened this summer is that these 3 helped train 2 high school students, Hudson Eagle Bear and Tesla Heavy Runner. So one of the things that happened is we taught them protocol. interview protocol, ethics protocol from inside the university, but also the protocol for approaching an elder. So these are little packages of tobacco that one uses when you approach an elder to conduct an interview. So this summer was them collecting this field data because we had been tasked by Tanya with putting together a digital storytelling library. And her idea was all this information that we had been collecting could be built into a mobile app to be shared with young children. So they'd get to practice a little Blackfoot, hear these stories, see these images, and hear these contemplations of values. And so that was what we were after. This project included a lot of community consultation. This is Tanya here in the picture with me. We went back to Opokaa-sin and said, how are we doing? Are we on the right track? Are we collecting the kind of information that you think is important, which was a key part of this project. And then the last summer, which was the summer that just ended, we conducted capacity camps. And it was actually Taylor who set up and ran these camps. We were going to build this library for Opokaa-sin, but who was going to run it? And so the capacity camps were about building the capacity to add to and maintain this digital resource for Opokaa-sin. And so once again, young people, sometimes as young as middle school and high school, came to the university campus. Here they are down near the NAS lounge going to Smudge to start the project. And again, they learned about how campus works and they participated in interviewing. Here's a picture of Hudson. We went out to collect sweetgrass. And the kids that were involved with this would then interview an elder about what was going on, what was happening. One other aspect of this is that we realized that we needed to get the voices of young people. And so one thing that happened is that we showed some of these images to young people who were working with Opokaa-sin, and they were interviewed, but they often responded through art. And as part of the capacity camps, Taylor had our young researchers paint pictures that would then be embedded into the mobile app. So this was something else that went on. So what I hope you see is how much data we had, and the problem we were confronting was how to build that into a mobile app that you can show on an iPhone. Now, I'm not going to show you that today. I encourage you to come up to me afterwards, and I can show you how the library works. But that meant making some decisions. And so one of the big decisions we confronted was what we were hearing from people actually were practices. It's important to go collect choke cherries. It's important to spend time with your family. But these are practices and not values. So we needed to get beyond just what people were doing. What does this mean to you? In addition to which, we had to somehow condense that into something that you could see on the screen of a gadget. And so one of the decisions we made was guided by the work of Opokaa-sin. They use what's called the Circle of Courage. This is based on the medicine wheel. This is a concept that you'll see throughout Indigenous North America and beyond. We often associate it with the work of Martin Brokenleg. And this is the book that Tanya uses in her work. So I'll just pop back. So this idea that there are 4 quadrants of belonging, mastery, generosity, and independence would then serve as the anchor for all this information that we were collecting. So how to do that? And so one of the things that happened here is that I was inspired by the work of Rabinow, Marcus, and Fabian about design studio. These are anthropologists influenced by science and technology studies who say that one of the things we should be paying attention to is what happens in design spaces. How are design problems solved? Architectural firms, how do they go through these, how do they solve these collaborative problems? So we stole that idea to use something we call design studios. I now have called it the Brown Paper Chronicles. So what we did through a series of meetings with Indigenous students at the U of L, with elders, with our own research team, with students in some of my classes, we sat down with a piece of brown paper, drew the circle of courage in the middle, looked at some photographs and started talking about what values do you see here? What are the values that you think are depicted in these pictures? So these prompted some amazing conversations. One that I always repeat is students who are majoring in Native American studies came down and talked to the research team, and there was a picture of teaching. And all the settlers said, well, that's clearly mastery. That's the quadrant that goes in. And the students said, no, that's generosity. That's the generosity of someone sharing their knowledge with you. So it immediately became apparent that we had different values, and this space became a space we talked about it. So you see this idea down here about co-constructing an ethical sphere. So one of the things that was important about this project was it didn't start during the era of the TRC, but it ended during the era of the TRC. And so we talked a lot about how do you create a space where people from different value systems come together and compare values in a place where you feel safe to share. And so this idea is often associated with Willie Ehrman, and I've stolen a slide that he and Reg Croshew produced about this idea of a space between where you can talk about such issues. So these design studios were amazing, and what people would talk, and they would write down their own little scribbled notes about what they thought were happening. And it became an exciting part of this project. So here is now the medicine wheel, or the circle of courage, with the values that we have ascribed to it. These are not actually all of them. As Tanya said, what we need is a little icon that goes like this, because you have to capture all those values and then come back to this little value. And this was, of course, what I asked my poor team to figure out how to do, and they did a marvelous job. One of the last things I'll say about this part of the project is, and one of the things I'm most proud of is this does not belong to me. It does not belong to the University of Lethbridge. It's now transferred entirely to Opokaa-sin. It's for Opokaa-sin to run their programs as a resource for them. It does not belong to us. And so they now face some decisions about how searchable do you make this mobile app. These are images of small children, questions that they have to confront, but we think is an important part of this project. So for me, one of the great things I learned in this project is about how, among Blackfoot folk, this is understood as a transfer, an exchange. Knowledge is exchanged between people because of social relationships. It's a slightly different way than we think about it in mainstream Canadian culture. So quickly, because I'm looking at my time, one other little project that we did, was amazing, was we got a grant from the Canada 150 fund through the Community Foundation of Southern Alberta. And as you can imagine, working with Indigenous people, getting Canada 150 funds, maybe not so much. So we were very glad that we got to use it for this particular project. And that was used for a project that was called Elders of the Future. And again, students were encouraged to put together art in response to the project itself, but alongside of it. This project was associated with Dr. Christine Alexander, who's the director of the Institute for Child and Youth Studies, and Ashley Henriksen and Caitlin Weaver were very important with that, as was Victoria Hollick. She never gets a call out, but Victoria helped all along, yes. All right. So the exhibit was this. It was an exhibit of the process of data collection, how it included not only standard ethnographic techniques, but the production of art. And you missed it, but it was excellent. And it stopped on October the 21st. This was the exhibit that came from it. All right. So I've run you through the Raising Spirit because I have some other things to say. So one of the things this project has become about for me is methods. What this design studio method that we used and innovated, I think. And I draw on Anne-Marie Moll here, who says our methods actually are a way we stage the world. What does she mean by that? Not that we make up worlds. The world's a big messy thing. We slice into it by particular methods, and we'll have particular views as a result of that. One of the things that motivated us was, and this actually comes from Marcus and Rabinow, is that everybody has a model of their social world, not just the anthropologists, not just the sociologists. So they talk about para-ethnography. What are the models that other people have of their world? Of course, I'd been working in child and youth studies. We think children are experts on their worlds as well, not just mediated through adults. So, and here he is, my favorite alien baby. Looks like a little dandelion seed, kind of blowing in the wind. So for those of us who work in child and youth studies, this is a big thing, the contrast between being and becoming. For child and youth studies scholars, children are fully realized human beings, full stop. Should be taken seriously in that way. And yet, how are they often thought about? As becomings, on the way to. And that there's a natural unfolding of childhood that is universal and we'll see all around the world. That's a problem. So this became something that began to irritate me intensely. And so now we begin the grumpy part of my talk. All right, so this set of questions brings together work I've done across my career. So I began as somebody who was interested in international development and critiques of international development. I ended looking at early childhood education and care in Indonesia as a form of international development. Here are some charts that we would see used. This is about charting the birth weight from birth, the growth and weight and height of a child along a curve that is taken to be normal. Now this has been dramatic. This one here collected in '92. This one a decade later. Same idea, only elaborated. Children will develop along a normal trajectory, and we should look for it and make sure that they follow it. We've seen this before. Ever since the 19th century, and we got excited about evolution, we believe that things unroll in a predetermined way towards a goal. You notice that we have Ernest Haeckel, who said, look, the development of the fetus mimics the development of society. And Edward Tyler, an anthropologist, just taught him in my theory class, he makes it more clear, right? That this is about a political argument, not just about an evolutionary argument. So I don't know if you can read it in the back. His evolutionary sequence has savages at the bottom, barbarians in the middle, and civilized people at the top. Depending on your own background, you'll be interested to see where you were once considered to fall on this sequence of development. So, children have long been used as a proxy for what is the character of human nature and how do we govern it. And so for a very long time, this thinking has produced a series of equivalencies that we still tend to use. The child is like the savage, and they are both like the third world, not yet developed, needing our intervention to succeed and follow this trajectory. So as an anthropologist, that makes me grumpy. We have talked about this for a very long time, since Mead in the early 20th century. Different societies value different things in their children. Some don't even value eye contact. Eye contact not valued. Learning words early, not valued. Being able to run around is valued. And so we know from work like, this is a recent scholar, Alyssa Crittenden, she's a behavioral ecologist who's long worked with the Hadza, who says, look, it depends on how you hold your baby, how they're told to sleep, what you encourage them to do. This is old news to anthropologists. Children look really different in different places, and if you raise them differently, you'll get different kinds of humans. Not surprising to us. So all of that brings me to some aspects of the Raising Spirit project that I want to talk about. So for example, that translation between mastery, independence, generosity, you all had an idea what that meant. And so what we tend to do is bring it into our world. But what does high energy mean? I don't know. I don't entirely know what it means to say that you want your child to have high energy. It's a Blackford term. We sat with elders a full day, parsing out words, trying to make them match. One of the things we know is that translation means you pull a word from one language and bring it into another. And we almost always do that in terms of English. That is the rule. So you take some word, a Blackfoot word that we were told over and over again, this is so complicated we can't turn it into English for you. And so translation becomes a way that we implicitly smuggle in those universal guides. One of the other things that's really important here is to notice how many of our stereotypes about local Blackfoot folks and indigenous people are based on these kinds of misunderstandings. Children are routinely taken away from their families because the family doesn't look quite right. And so one of the things that I did was go and grab a template, because you can get a template of a family tree anytime, anywhere, because that's how we think families work. Now this one is not bad. Grandparents, it's kind of a big bubble, and it turns out that grandparents are hugely important to Blackfoot folk, right? But the rest of this tree doesn't look so good. Turns out siblings are important. Aunties and uncles are important. So on the right side, you'll see what all the social theorists are talking about, how we should talk about rhizomatic relationships. This looks much more like a Blackfoot family, a mesh of different family relationships that support children and child rearing. And it was my own partner who mentioned this to me. Very old study from Levy, 1973. And I love this. When Tahitian teachers slap Tahitian students for behaving like good Tahitian children but bad students, obviously the children are placed in a self-definitional bind. Again, there is a normative guide that has been provided, and people are not measuring up. Every chart that says should is really a chart about should not. So I'm going to take one more minute, Claudia. No, don't even stop me. Here's my last story. This actually came from a student who's being educated in this building, who is a practicing nurse. She was told, because the province of Alberta says swaddling is bad, that she has to tell local Indigenous parents swaddling is bad. Look, people have swaddled forever. Humans have swaddled their babies. And so being trained in culturally appropriate practices on this campus and yet told by the provincial government you're not allowed to tell people that they can swaddle our children. This is what I'm talking about. So what's the problem, y'all? That's the problem, whiteness. This is how we think about development. It's a developing white folk. It's not about developing other folks. And we are still resistant to listening to other models of child rearing and what they can provide us. So I won't talk about bad science, because Claudia has, but that's actually album art from a band called Bad Science. Comes from my hometown, Springfield, Missouri. I just want to say. Okay, so I must finish now. Thank you very much.